Hey everybody, Sean, your host here for the Pan Future Society podcast. Today is September 10th, 2016, and this week I have my first interview. I spoke to A.C. Hachem, a science fiction author from Los Angeles, California, and we talked about his upcoming book. It's his debut novel, The Dawn of Legaia. And it's going to be at least part of a planned trilogy, if not a further expanded universe. We talked about his book. We talked about some geeky science stuff. Initially, this was going to be a break from my series on artificial intelligence, but it turns out we ended up talking extensively about artificial intelligence. So it's sort of a part 4-ish thing in my unintentionally ongoing series there. We talked for quite a while, and we probably could have talked for several hours, and it went well for my first interview. So most likely we'll be talking again in the future about various things. In the interest of keeping the show slightly shorter, I'm going to give you just a couple of quick hits on news items this week, and some things to check out. I will have links in the show notes for these things. It is the 50th anniversary of Star Trek, so yay, happy anniversary to one of the most influential cultural phenomena in the last 100 years, perhaps. We're still enjoying Gene Roddenberry's legacy. We're still looking to Star Trek as a model of how we might be in the future. So that's great, 50 years of Star Trek. And the other thing this week that you should definitely check out, there is a Mars gigapixel panorama available online. This is from the Mars Curiosity rover. It took a 360-degree photo, panoramic. If you look at it on the web, you can point your mouse in all different directions and get this great view of Mars, but you can also, courtesy of this website, if you look at it on your phone or with a VR system, you can stand in the middle of the room and turn around and pretend that you are on Mars. I don't have a VR headset myself, but I looked at it on my phone, and it is just very cool. To experience Mars like that. I mean, it's not only great that we have science like the Mars rover and Juno sending back its early pictures. The fact that the technology has gotten to the point where it's not just kind of an okay picture that scientists are going to get a lot out of and the rest of us think is sort of cool. You're as close to there as possible now. The resolutions are so good. The quality is good. It's great. Anyway, I will have a link to that in the show notes, the Mars gigapixel panorama from the Curiosity rover. It's a great thing to look at. So that was your very quick news of the moment. And now on with the interview. Thank you, everyone, for joining me on the podcast this week. I have my first interview this week with author A.C. Hachem from Los Angeles, California. Welcome to the show, A.C.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Great. So we connected on Twitter. I forget who followed who first, but we seem to be sort of following the same other people in relation to futurism and technology and artificial intelligence and all that sort of thing.
Right.
So that's why I'm having a fiction author on my show. But first, I guess, give me a little background on you and how you got pointed in the direction of being a science fiction author.
Sure thing. Well, I guess I've been really, attempting to actually write genre fiction for about 5 or 6 years now. Mm-hmm. And I've been writing for a total of about 8. But, most people don't just wake up one morning and decide, hey, I'm going to write speculative fiction. There are a lot of things that usually lead up to that. Uh-huh. So just growing up as a kid, I've always been into, whether it be, movies, a little dabbling with comic books, but primarily a lot of other, pop culture or genre fiction type of things. Collected Magic the Gathering cards, cartoons. Was really big on video games. We've been playing those for quite some time now. So these were all kind of like the things that I guess groom a person to become an adult. Science fiction and genre fiction and pop culture and all the good things that go with it. And I guess kind of when you get a little bit older, then you start getting more into the technical side of things, which would be some of the other things you listed earlier, like, the artificial intelligence, space exploration, and I guess the big kid stuff.
Yeah, exactly. yeah, it's an interesting way that we have now so many different things that can feed our creativity and keep our minds open, I guess, throughout our entire lives. I mean, I just turned 40 myself, and I still play video games, and I am not ashamed of that.
I second that notion.
So, well, that's cool. I see on your bio, you listed The Matrix as one of your biggest early influences.
Correct.
What was it about The Matrix that lit that spark?
Oh my goodness! I mean, any fan of that film, any major fan of that story, is probably thinking no further explanation needed. But that was a great story that was really well timed. The late '90s were a period of time during which the information age and computing experienced a huge mainstream boom. And, in that film and that story, the characters, the film and story's general kind of look and feel and taste, combined with the era during which it was released, was really kind of like something that made for a perfect storm. And I was probably, I think, a junior in high school when that film came out. But I just remember being in love with it from the get-go, and I've probably seen it a dozen times since. And if it happens to be on the TV while I'm flipping it through the channels, even now I'll still stop what I'm doing and sit down and probably watch.
Yeah, that's great. I actually haven't watched it in a long time. I should watch it again and see what I think after a number of years of that sort of technology developing in the real world. And see what
Stories
I think of it.
like The Matrix are superb for a lot of different reasons, but one of the things that kind of sets The Matrix and other movies like The Matrix apart is how diverse and how multifaceted they are. Sure, they have all the elements that make for a good film. That's a given based on the success that film achieved. But when you start to incorporate the philosophical elements and just the other kind of subplots, the things that are very subconsciously incorporated into the film, those are the types of things that kind of really set it apart from the rest. Because a lot of stories fall into one of a few buckets. And creative direction and aesthetics usually make or break films in situations like that. But once you start getting really deep and start incorporating, political and geopolitical influence and flavor, and really start kind of hitting all these various buttons, again, whether it's very kind of in your face or very, very in between the lines. These are the types of films that happen to be some of my favorites, and the ones that I think appeal to genre fiction and pop culture enthusiasts on the widest level, because they satisfy, the intellectual demands of a movie viewer and genre fiction enthusiasts, but they also kind of just open your eyes, if you will, and kind of, whether a person realizes or not, stories like that and movies like that kind of just take your thought process to a different place.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the things that film was able to execute pretty darn well.
Yeah, that's, you said a few moments ago, too, that one of the things about The Matrix was its timing and how it arrived on the scene right at the cusp of the boom in the internet and artificial intelligence and things like that.
Right.
I wonder if I hadn't thought of it that way, but I wonder if The Matrix kind of stands as a sort of a tentpole sort of movie, the way Star Trek arrived sort of at the cusp of the space age. And I wonder if movies that we've seen recently, like The Martian or Ex Machina, will sort of fit that bill. 10 or 15 or 20 years from now, we'll look at them the same way we would The Matrix.
There's definitely an element of truth to that, absolutely. Because if you take a look at all of these iconic films or these iconic stories, they're the ones that are kind of shaping the mold, if you will. So I absolutely agree with that statement, and I think there's definitely a sense of truth to that you can have a wonderfully executed story on every level, but the ones that are really going to stand out in people's minds are the ones that are doing all the right things and just so happen to be doing them at just the right time, and those are the ones that are kind of very definitive, defining movies within their genre and within their time period as well. So there's absolutely some truth to that, in my opinion, anyway.
Yeah, cool. Now, recently, too, I've noticed in science fiction in general, there's been a seemingly large boom in stories, both in print and on film and television, that are very realistic or intend to be realistic. Like, as I mentioned, The Martian, they try to get the science right. Or
like an Interstellar.
Yeah, Interstellar. Yeah. Or if you've seen the TV show, what is the Sci-Fi Channel show? I just totally blanked on the name. The Expanse. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of elements, little details about the way spacesuits work or the way, certain things would actually work in space. And on the one hand, I think it's been great, but I don't really want to lose the fiction in the science fiction.
Sure.
I also like still hearing stories that are things that seem impossible, because I think that fuels the imagination to, think that something is impossible, but maybe,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what's your take on that? Hyperrealism versus is it just all part of a spectrum? And do you have a preference for one or the other?
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a good point, and I think what it really just boils down to is kind of different strokes for different folks. You're going to have your Interstellar, Martian type films that are primarily science with this little sprinkle of fiction, if you will. And then you're going to have stuff on the opposite end that might be something you see maybe even a little bit more so in the video game industry, where, it skews toward the fiction side and has the hints of the science here and there. But they are definitely all part of the bigger spectrum, as you mentioned. And within any genre of anything, regardless of what type of medium you're looking at, whether it be literature, film, music, so on and so forth, you're going to have subgenres. And underneath those subgenres, you're going to have additional subgenres within subgenres within subgenres. And the same thing definitely applies to film. And that's why you've got the elements of realism. You've got your super niche stuff like your steampunk and nanopunk, and everything else we know and love. So I think they definitely all fall under the science fiction umbrella. And, which one of those types of science fiction a person really prefers or gravitates toward is primarily really nothing more than a question of personal preference. But especially where we're at now with our current state as far as space exploration is concerned, you're definitely for the foreseeable future going to have a heavy interest in the stuff that looks like it may become a possibility in the next decade or 2 or 3 at the most. Stuff like your Martian and your Interstellar, but there will absolutely always be room for some of the less realistic stuff. And personally, I probably enjoy a little bit of all of it. I even enjoy catching a documentary here and there too. But that sort of science fiction definitely isn't a favorite of mine by any means. But I have a pretty wide diet.
Yeah.
As far as the sci-fi that I enjoy is concerned. I like some things that kind of fall into the sci-fi fantasy genre as well. I'm not too big on fantasy, but I am a pretty big fan of Game of Thrones and Magic the Gathering, which is something I follow either closely or loosely, depending on what my schedule looks like.
Yeah.
Definitely has a fantasy element to it as well. So I tend to judge sci-fi related projects kind of more on other elements in their quality versus just what subgenre or what niche they fall into. But if I encounter a good story or a good game in the broadest type of sci-fi or even the most niche type of sci-fi, as long as it's a good product, it's probably right up my alley.
Yeah, that's great. As a musician myself too, as I've gotten older, you sort of learn the same perspective that when you find something that's done well, you appreciate it for that sake, and its exact details or whatever box it fits in are not as important anymore. Well, at this point, why don't you tell us a lot more about your book?
Sure.
So
I've got a debut work of science fiction that I've been working on and off for about the last 5 years or so. And the book titled Dawn of Legaia, which is slated for a November 11th release of this year, is definitely a multifaceted story, kind of going back to what we're talking about, the Matrix having so many different themes and subplots and moving parts. It's really hard to kind of put it in a box and say, this is what it is, and kind of just give it a defining label. I don't know if I would want to do that.
That's
anyway.
I was reading when I was reading your descriptions on your website about the book. I sort of got the take that with the cyberpunk, nanopunk, it was definitely going to be a story about people, and the impact of technology on those people. But it was going to be a more personal story rather than sort of the Star Trek grand galactic scale sort of approach. Right.
I would agree with that. I mean, at its core, I guess I would kind of define it as a coming-of-age story. It's about a young 22-year-old college student / prodigy named Monty Sizek. And basically what he's been tasked with is leveraging his abilities and his technological and scientific prowess to work on a project which happens to be a large-scale space station that's getting ready to debut very soon. And the story actually takes place in the later part of this century, in 2083, in Los Angeles as well as low Earth orbit. And it's basically a story about this young man and the experiences that he gains while attending school and making this huge transition from going to living in the city that he's grown up in his entire life to having to live on something that's kind of like an international space station on steroids, if you will. And the things that he experiences, the way that he the hurdles that he has to overcome, the obstacles he faces, as well as some of the relationships he forges during this process, which happens to be relationships with humans as well as androids. So there are definitely interesting dynamics going on there as far as the dynamic between him and his, android counterpart, if you will, him and his mentor, which is the professor he works with, which also happens to be the founder of the university he trains at, as well as the project lead on the Legaia project, which is the Legaia International Space Colony. The dynamic between the android and the professor, the lady friend that he kind of has a crush on, and a couple of other pretty pertinent characters that are introduced throughout the course of the story, as well as, of course, the antagonist, which is named Richard Kurlock. And I'll let people form their own opinions on him. But he's probably not the world's worst person, but he definitely has a few major quirks, and
he's got
he's
his
a
own
little bit
agenda,
misguided.
right? Yeah.
But so it's definitely you're absolutely right when you say that it's a story more so about these people, and that's why even though during the mentionings on my website or some of my blog posts, even though I don't like to just put it in a box, I do like to provide people with a few descriptive terms that can help people get a better idea or a better gauge for, hey, what can we expect? And that's why on one of my blog posts I mentioned, hey, it's not a space opera, it's not some huge interplanetary type of saga. It's more of a medium sci-fi, near future science fiction story. Definitely a lot of cyberpunk, biopunk, nanopunk type elements. So it's not the mildest of sci-fi, nor is it extremely heavy. But I mean, a lot of that kind of also has to do with trying to appeal to a slightly wider audience. So you want core science fiction fans to absolutely enjoy the story, but you don't want somebody to have to be some sort of a computer language programmer just to understand the text of your novel. And that's why finding that medium is definitely one of many juggling acts that you have to perform when you're writing a genre fiction novel. But I wanted to try to keep it somewhere in that middle ground so that I could appease hardcore sci-fi fans as well as maybe passive or milder fans of science fiction.
Yeah. Well, that sounds great. I look forward to checking that out. Everybody put that on your calendars for November 11th. Now, one of the things I do on the show here, since I am not a scientist by training, I'm often digging into terminology that I don't necessarily know entirely what it means, or I kind of have a vague understanding, and I get to learn more about it. So in your descriptions here, you've mentioned several different types of punk, and I guess I'm not quite up on all my punks. What in the world is nanopunk?
So some of those terms are, just first and foremost, they're subgenres of science fiction, and they're pretty official, so they're pretty widely used. But I would say, for the most part, these types of terms are terms that are used more so in literary circles versus, the general public. So you really won't hear too many people walking into your local bookstore and throwing words like these around. But if you do happen to be, again, like a super core fan of genre fiction, or somebody that works in the entertainment industry in some sort of capacity relating to speculative fiction, these are probably terms you've at least heard before. But they're probably a lot less complex than you think, and they're probably a lot more self-explanatory than you would think. So I think probably the most popular version of these types of designations is probably steampunk. Yeah. That's probably one people are more familiar with.
Familiar with that. Cyberpunk, neuropunk.
Yeah, exactly. And that is kind of more of a, a dystopian type of science fiction where, although a story may take place in the future, technology may have kind of taken a step back or two, and a lot of, the technological or computing or electronic advancements that we know of today are kind of lost, and things are kind of reverting back to, being more dependent on older technologies such as steam power, for example.
Sure.
So that's where those types of elements come into play, and the genre is kind of taken on its own kind of aesthetic appearance with the leather and the copper and all that stuff, but. Cyberpunk, very similarly, is kind of a descriptive term to describe a subgenre of science fiction that deals with an era of technological advancement, a period where computing, cybernetics, these types of things, artificial intelligence, these themes are prevalent. And kind of the same thing applies to biopunk, with the only major difference being there's a biological element at play. So when you're talking about cyborgs, when you're talking about, a biological state of technological advancement.
Genetic manipulation.
There you go. Yeah. Exactly. And kind of, again, same thing with the nanopunk is basically any type of, science fiction archetype where you're talking about the prevalence of nanotechnology. So just machinery or equipment or even computing hardware that's on a very, very atomic, tiny scale. And there have been a couple authors that have kind of carved that niche out for themselves. There have been a couple of movies that have implemented it. I remember seeing some elements of it in a G.I. Joe, in a pretty recent G.I. Joe movie that didn't do too well at the box office. But they're actually not as complex as you would think.
Okay, cool. So we've got our glossary terms lined up today.
There you go.
Now, part of what I'd like to bring to the show too is to always keep your creativity and imagination going, even if you're not working in a creative field. You kind of want to fuel your mind that way. So when you're sitting down to work on your book or whatever it may be, is there a particular process you go through? Have you thought about, I want my book to be like this, so you're consuming other books and movies that are like it, so you're sort of primed for it? Or do you try to maybe distance yourself from things that might be similar?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, and it's a very, deep-rooted and multifaceted question. I think when you're talking to people in any type of medium, even outside of the creative verticals, I think a lot of people have processes that they enjoy due to things like habit, personal preference, just what they're comfortable with. And some of it is actually just when you first start doing something, you try to stick to doing it the way you've done it in the past, because that's what your mind has associated with that act or that procedure or whatever it may be. So, I mean, I definitely have a lot of little quirks or things that I kind of do when it comes to the process of writing or the process of editing. In the past, I really tried to shy away from kind of trying to mimic or mirroring other types of writing styles or writing genres or whatever the case may be. My original ideology was that I wanted to try to keep things as original and as me as possible. And that meant, kind of shying away from other work. But as you get older, as you lose a little bit of your greenness, you start to realize that you can't isolate yourself from these elements, because it's actually the exposure to these elements that's part of what's going to fuel you becoming better at your craft. So you can't dodge films. You can't not read other people's books, because those are the things that you need to use as a gauge and as a source of experience for you to be able to improve upon your own work. So, I mean, like anything else in life, you live and you learn. And my habits have definitely changed over the course of the last few years. But there are definitely a few things that I feel very comfortable with when it comes to producing work. Not that I can't produce work without these things. It's just, again, a lot of it is just kind of a force of habit. So I really need music. I really enjoy listening to music while I work. I tend not to try to work at home, only because there are too many distractions there for me, including a 17-pound canine that won't leave me alone for longer than 5 or 10 minutes. And the fridge being 5 or 10 feet away from my laptop doesn't help either.
Yeah.
And so over the course of the years, I've just gotten comfortable in certain atmospheres, certain settings, and again, trying to stay in line with what is good for you and what works best. I try to just recreate or mimic those types of atmospheres for myself whenever possible. But caffeine is good. There are different schools of thought on that, but I'm definitely an advocate of utilizing it when I'm trying to create. Is it the best habit? Probably not, but... Well,
there are far worse habits to have than that one.
This is true. This is absolutely true.
I am definitely
so I do definitely enjoy a cup of coffee or two before I work and during working, and music is a huge huge source of inspiration as well as concentration for me. I'm a huge fan of film scores as well as video game scores. So I'm typically either listening to some sort of subgenre of electronic music or actual scores while I'm trying to work, and it's worked well for me in the past. And hey, if it ain't broken, don't fix it.
Yeah. All right. So I guess I don't have any more questions about the creative process or anything like that. Maybe next I ask you about, in terms of futurism and technology, what's the thing that's sort of bubbling on this right at the surface right now that you're most interested in terms of what we might see, in our lives in 5 or 10 years?
I mean, the first thing that probably comes to my mind as being one of the biggest hot button topics is something people have been hearing about a lot lately, and that's definitely the realm of artificial intelligence and all the automation that kind of comes in tow with that. And I'm definitely enjoying, hearing the opinions of different industry professionals, whether those pros be from the computing and engineering types of backgrounds, or even hearing what Elon Musk and Bill Gates have to say about this sort of stuff is definitely intriguing. But I definitely think that's going to be one of the core topics that's discussed over the course of the anywhere between the next couple years to the next couple decades, because it's obviously going to have a pretty significant impact on what the rest of the foreseeable future and what the rest of our lives really shapes up to look like. And the same way the computing industry experienced that huge boom in the late 90s, I mean, there's got to be an AI type of boom looming on the cusp there. And exactly when that hammer will strike is hard for me to say. But I mean, that's definitely something that's interesting, because it's not just the kind of like the overshadowing question of what people like to talk about in reference to whether or not artificial intelligence is a threat, which is an important thing to talk about because that's obviously pretty important. But another thing I think is also pretty important to keep in mind is just the impact that it's going to directly have on people's day-to-day lives, the manner in which we utilize our commutes or our transportation, the way we utilize energy. So it's not just a question of the robot overlord takeover. It's also a question of how is this going to impact, some of the things that we've grown so accustomed to, like the way we get from point A to point B, and the way we communicate with our friends and family. So, the trickle-down effect of the advent of artificial intelligence is probably going to have an even more significant and direct impact on our lives than, a rogue machine of some sort. So it's definitely interesting to contemplate all that stuff.
Yeah, I've been thinking, I mean, there's a few things I've covered in the show already, but the artificial intelligence, I think once it really sort of hits its stride and starts showing up in a lot more places, it might be even more revolutionary than the computer itself. I don't know that we've seen something with this kind of potential since the internal combustion engine was actually invented.
Right.
I think I was just reading a news article today about Lowe's, the hardware home improvement store chain, is going to be debuting a robot sales associate this fall in some of its stores. And that's okay. So there are people working on things that will eventually mean that every customer service job will be done by a robot, which part of me thinks that's a great idea. But then what are all those people with those jobs going to do?
Right. No, I mean, that's definitely food for thought. The one thing that I can say that I'm glad about, and I think is a good thing, is that so many people are kind of playing devil's advocate and considering the negatives associated with these technologies and kind of the worst case scenarios, because I would much rather have people be contemplating these aspects of these newer technologies. I'd much rather have them be discussing these things now versus, when we're halfway into that, as you mentioned, that looming boom or too far into it. So the fact that people are already having these huge debates about this sort of thing while these autonomous robots and this artificial intelligence is still in its infancy, I think is a great thing, because there is a lot of potential for bad out there.
It's
on an autonomous level, as well as technology being utilized improperly. And I think having those safety valves and those safeguards in place is just as important as actually figuring out how to revolutionize the technology itself. So I'm glad that people are really putting that aspect of it to the forefront as well.
Yeah, it's very different. I don't know if it's just because it's computer related or it's being done not strictly by a government, but it's very different than, say, the development of nuclear weapons in World War II, which was a very secretive, behind closed doors. Only a few people were working on it, and certainly some of the scientists who worked on it were horrified by the results. But the cat was well out of the bag by the time the world at large kind of knew what the potential there was. So we're definitely seeing the artificial intelligence is being developed far more out in the open than I think any other major technology has been. That's interesting.
And that opens the door up to, crowdsourcing or the type, people just working on things collaboratively in real time, and coming up with solutions in groups and these think tanks, and they always say two heads are better than one, and I'm a firm believer of that. So I think it's a good thing that you've got millions of people putting in their input on something versus just a handful of scientists, for example.
Yeah, that's great.
The potential is huge, and obviously, as with most things in life, there's definitely a downside. And as long as people keep that in mind and try to figure out solutions as much as they try to figure out innovation, we don't have crystal balls, and it's fun to speculate on this stuff and write about it. But ultimately, no matter what you do, there's always going to be an element that you just can't foresee or gauge. And let's just hope a lot of this new technology is used for good things and not bad things, I suppose.
Yeah, in general, it seems like people aren't that good at responding to a potential crisis until it's already happened.
Right.
But it seems like because of the openness of all this, and just the sheer number of people who are involved in it, I don't see it being quite as reactionary, us reacting to something after something horrible has happened, but being able to grab the bull by the horns now, before any crisis takes place.
Yeah, the information age is definitely a huge contributor to that. The speed and the availability of information. And it just goes to show you kind of the difference of living during the time in which we're living now versus maybe several decades ago, like the example that you brought up where the nuclear bomb was being developed. Definitely a completely different era we're living in now, and I think there are a lot more pros to it than cons as far as the information age as a whole is concerned.
Yeah, great. Well, I don't think I have any other particular questions for you. Now, going to plug your book one more time. Dawn of Legaia is coming out November 11th. And this is also a part of a planned trilogy, is it not?
Yeah, the story is definitely going to be, at the very least, a 3-part series. And I definitely have a few, ideas stirring in the old noggin as far as ways to expand on that or spin-off novels and things of that sort. Again, the story is kind of just so robust that there are definitely situations that we can explore in entirely separate books as far as, timelines are concerned, or secondary supporting characters are concerned. There's a lot of opportunity out there, and really the options are endless. But it's going to, at the very least, be a 3-part series to conclude, the core of the story. It's definitely an exciting time for sure.
Great, cool. Well, I look forward to seeing more of this universe that you're crafting there. So once again, AC Hachem, thank you for joining me on the show and talking about your upcoming book and some other futuristic techno things and film stuff. I really appreciate you joining me here on the first interview.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. People can feel free to visit my website at www.achashem.com. And I also have a blog that's updated on a daily basis at the same domain /blog. And I definitely post a lot of content up there in regards to news and information about my literary projects, but also, fandom, science fiction, and pop culture as a whole. So anybody that's interested in, having a nice, fresh news source for that type of stuff can definitely feel free to check out that site as well. And I will do my best to keep everyone in the loop as far as things, information and events leading up to the release of the book on November 11th. But I'm pretty active on Twitter, and I'm also pretty active on my website. So if anybody feels like chatting about anything, they can definitely feel free to reach out to me at AC Hachem on Twitter, or drop me a line on my website, achashem.com.
Yeah, and that's AC Hachem is ACHACHEM.com.
You got it.
So you go find it. And I do read your blog frequently, and I really enjoy it. It's you write blog posts the way I would write blog posts if I blogged about those things. So,
well, there you go.
So they're great reads.
That means something's being done right. As far as your opinion is concerned, anyway.
Yeah, and it's my show here, so that's all that matters, right?
There you go.
All right.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun, absolutely.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for joining me on the show, and we'll have to talk to you again in the future.
Excellent, yeah.
All right.
I'd be up for it, absolutely.
Great, thanks.
Sure thing.
All right, there is your interview, and that is your show for the week. Thanks again to AC for joining me. We'll definitely have him back, and we'll be doing more interviews in the future, too. The show is quite a bit longer than the normal ones. Thank you for sticking with me through the whole thing here. And I always enjoy a good, in-depth, rambling conversation like that. I will definitely have some more in the future. So, come and join us online at panfuture.org. Come find me on Twitter, panfuturecast, Facebook, all that stuff. Drop me an email, leave some comments on the show page, whatever you would like to do. And I will talk to you again in the future.